everyone. My name is Melody Jones-Poynton.
And I'm the Reverend Thomas de Vermouth.
And we are excited to walk the Sunrise Road together today.
The Sunrise Road podcast is a podcast with conversations that connect and weave hope into the fabric of our shared lives.
Thank you for joining us, and here's this week's conversation. Our guest this week is one of my favorite people in the entire world. So many good memories and so much good friendship over the past 20 years. It's been a while. Mardis Lecroy is one of my friends from seminary. We met like in the early days of seminary. And so Mardis and I have walked through our entire seminary career together, getting our first called and installed positions together. Mardis lived for many years here in the Midwest, and we did not take proper advantage of that. But during the pandemic, he and his wife, who also happens to be a Presbyterian pastor, moved to New Jersey. It's like the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So one is serving at a church in Pennsylvania and one is in New Jersey. Is that right?
Yes. Mary Beth in New Jersey, me in Pennsylvania.
That's very appropriate. Very appropriate because you are originally from Pennsylvania. And you're actually a clergy in the United Church of Christ, but you're one of our beloved brothers who is doing some time in the PCUSA. So thanks.
Feels like coming home.
I'm so glad. So
we're going to skip over the predestination jokes. Yeah. So we were thinking about what it means to do evangelism in the world today, and a lot has changed since COVID. And I don't want to overplay that, but I also don't want to underplay that. So what we've invited Mardis to have a conversation with Thomas and me about evangelism, what it means to share our faith today, and how we might go about sharing our faith. So there's nothing like putting you on the spot right away. Do you have, either of you, both of you, a one sentence definition of evangelism? And I would ask that of all three of us. A one sentence. Yeah. I posted this in a Facebook group and somebody gave me a 20-sentence quote from Eugene Peterson that was awesome and wonderful. And I want to affirm whoever posted that. But one sentence.
If I do, it's not terribly original. I think it would be something like evangelism is sharing the good news of what God in Christ is doing for me through my local church. Period. One long sentence.
I should have written that down. So sharing the good news, because we're going to have to define a lot of these things.
Sure.
Sharing the good news of what God
in Christ
is
doing for me through my local church.
That sorry, a lot packed in there. Yeah, it's a long sentence. I don't think I can do that. Melody. I mean, yes, I can say sharing the good news in some way, but I mostly have questions immediately. I keep thinking about that Robbie Williams song. I tried to remember which it was, and it has that line in it. What was so great about the Great Depression? And when evangelization is the sharing of the good news, the immediate question is, what is so good about the good news?
Right.
And that's where a lot of my baggage come in. And I think that's also why we have this conversation here, because I think there's so much so not obvious to evangelization in comparison to the way I, as an evangelical young Christian, grew up with thinking about evangelization. Because the good news that I felt like I had to share back in the day was terrible news for many people.
Yes.
And
And to me, I don't know if I have a one sentence description, but I have a one sentence test of practice. I think it's not good news until it's good news for all.
Ooh.
And that to me is kind of like a disclaimer. When we talk about proclaiming good news or sharing good news, that is just always in the back of my mind, and it's also my hardest critique, and the hardest critic as well. If whenever I open my mouth, yeah.
We have similar backgrounds, you and I think, because I was also raised in an evangelical milieu where whatever evangelism was, it was about telling people, if you're not like me, there will be eternal consequences for that. So why don't you come and be like me? And I also do not want any part of that. Now, that's very foreign to the way that I would think about this now. Yeah.
So then the question is, what is the good news?
My definition deliberately has some slippage there. I think I do have an agenda here and how I'm thinking about evangelism, because we can talk in theologically correct abstractions. God in Christ is reconciling the world to God's self, right? But that's so abstract that I don't find it very helpful. To my way of thinking, part of evangelism is church people becoming articulate about what God is doing for me, personally, specifically, me, and being able to say, here is what God is doing for me through my local church. Whether that is, I struggle with addiction, and the church is the place where I have found people who help me heal from that. Or it is really hard to raise children in this crazy 21st century world, and the church is my village that surrounds me. Or I would be without community and lonely were it not for this place where I can connect. And when I think about it that way, I'm imagining that different people are going to have different answers. And part of my work as a pastor and equipping the saints is to help people see and speak about, what is God doing for you here?
I like that. I like that. That breaking down really on the anchor point. It's like that you have to learn to say I, and you kind of admit with that you're not going to speak for everyone else.
Yes.
Is that's so crucial, because otherwise you are trying to put whatever good news you think is on someone else, and then this doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily good news anymore. Yeah.
You're sort of verging on one of my very favorite topics. A thinker who's really important to me is Anna Carter Florence. I did my Doctor of Ministry thesis on her work on preaching, and when I defended my thesis, the main criticism that I received was that this is not so much a work of academic criticism as a gushing fanboy love letter to Anna Carter Florence. I said, yeah, pretty much. You're right. But one of the things that she has taught me that I try to hold on to is that different people's experiences are different. And she's made me think a lot about how that informs preaching, but it also informs evangelism, meaning that it's not for me to tell you, here's the good news for you, because there's something patronizing about that, right? I'm putting myself in a position like I know what's best for you. I think my role is to help you articulate what's good news for you, because your experience is not my experience, and I want to honor that and hold space for that.
Yeah. It presupposes that that God is good, and
Yes.
and all that's what you said, like the theological abstract that God loves me, and God loves everyone else, even those I don't. Yeah.
I think that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another aspect of my definition that I wanted to make sure I put on the table, kind of highlight, is the notion that if we're going to talk about evangelism for mainline Protestant churches in 2023, I think we have to decouple it from results. And what I mean by that, evangelism is not church growth, in other words. And so often when we talk about evangelism, we very quickly veer into strategies for getting people into the pews, increasing your numbers, increasing your worship attendance. And the truth is, we're facing such severe cultural and demographic headwinds that there's just no guaranteed way anymore. There's no formula or 5-point plan that is guaranteed to generate more people in your church today than were there a year ago. A lot of churches lost ground during COVID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I talk about evangelism, I want to be really clear. I am not talking about how to get people in your church. That to me, that can be an important and interesting conversation, but I don't think that evangelism should be results driven. I think it's about encouraging and equipping people to speak their truth about the good God is doing for them.
I do think that we try to boil evangelism down to results. And I mean, and that's how I was trained. I don't know if either of you remember the stunning book. I believe it was by Bill Hybels, and if it wasn't, then I'll have to come back and correct that, called Becoming a Contagious Christian.
Yes.
That actually had, is that who it was by, Mardis? Was Bill Hybels?
It sounds right, but I want to.
Yeah, and like in it, there is actually a formula for how to increase participation in the church because of what you are sharing with people. And so it like lays out a formula. And I think Thomas and I have talked about this before, about like what happens when we reduce our faith down to a formula, because all three of us have different formulas. You know, I mean, like there's so what is the point of evangelism, I guess, would be the next, if it's not results oriented. And I had shared with Mardis a little bit previously the history of us here at East Ridge Presbyterian Church, which is a beautiful history. And I love and want to embrace this history because it is the story that many churches of the 1950s and 60s could tell, where we were a mission church on the edge of town. We started in a field in a neighborhood that was being built by the Strauss brothers, and they donated land to 5 different worshiping communities. And the first pastor here literally built the church he would watch in the neighborhood and see when people were moving in to their houses. And he would, like, people still have these stories. He would go over and he would greet them. He might even help them move in and carry stuff in. And by the end of dinner, he would have a commitment from them to see them on Sunday. And on Sunday, he would have a commitment and a place for them to be in the choir, on a deacon session, so a Sunday school teacher, some way involved. But there were no houses here, so it was like you could do that because you could see the house crop up. Well, part of our story here at East Ridge is that in the early 2000s, we studied a book, and I think it was called When Not to Build or something like that. And it was all about, like, do we want to remain in this community that is now established in our neighborhood, or do we want to move to the edge of town or to an area where it is growing? And we, this church, decided not to do that. So we claim very strongly that we are a neighborhood church. So our ideas of evangelism and the history of evangelism and how the church is going to grow, I think just don't work, especially post-COVID.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's so much, sort of two thoughts as you share that. First, to go back to Bill Hybels, I don't want to make too big a deal about this, but what we didn't know when we were reading that book, and we know now, is that Bill Hybels is kind of a creepy dude, right? It turns out that there were some integrity issues. And I do not think that that is coincidental or accidental. I think that Contagious Christian book operated out of a theology that sees other people as objects for me to manipulate into my church, right? I've got a formula and I'm going to massage you and work you just so that you become a member. There's something, his lack of personal integrity should make us at least a little suspicious of the writing and thinking that he produced. That's one thing. But the second is that I think the story of Eastridge underscores the challenge that so many of our mainline congregations face, is that our high water mark was largely about demographics, right? When you look at mainline Protestant churches like My United Church of Christ, like the PCUSA, and the others in that family, all exploded during the post-war baby boom. And I haven't looked up for the PCUSA, but I think for the United Church of Christ, the high watermark of membership was the year 1960. And it was all downhill from there. So if you were starting a church or expanding it, that was a time when you could just hang a shingle on the door that said church and open the door and get out of the way, and people would come rushing in. And so we look back at that as our glory days. And the truth is, we didn't have to exert a lot of effort to bring those people in. They just came because it was 1960 and that was what you do. We're in a very different climate now that calls for different approaches. And if I knew what that was, I could write a book and go out on the lecture circuit, but I haven't
live off
the
book. Yeah. You could republish it with a slightly different title every other year. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Yeah, for me, along the same vein is like what worked back then with going door to door and asking for commitment. Apparently, that you found an open door there in that time. That was the kairos for that, I guess, or whatever you want to call that. And to me, or maybe that's also personality, I would be really repulsed by that happening to me today. I was like, what does this dude want from me? And, ooh, he's really pushy, or or he's very oily, or I mean, all those kind of things that we've had in the meantime of experiencing 70 years of marketing since, and kind of this developed our senses and to respond to this constant bombardment of people who are trying to sell me something. So if I take me as a sample,
yeah,
and that is really something that does not work. I'm trying to think what does work for me is if someone is not trying too hard. Has me want that and comes across as authentic, real, not too polished, and yeah, it doesn't seem to have the magic formula, because I don't believe in that either. Yeah.
So let's just say that in the 1950s and 60s, there was nothing on the news, like I saw this morning, was on every channel about the new spam, all of the many ways to be spammed, and how to filter out those people who are out to scam you, including the people who come to your door, who are checking out, like in Home Alone, 1990s movie, Home Alone, the people who are coming to your door in order to see, like, and I totally live that. Like, I'm super suspicious of people who come to my door. I never let them in the house. If, like, and I think that is just a change in climate, and our expectation is that first, I want to know that it's a person and not a bot. And I don't always know how to tell the difference. And my phone doesn't always know how to tell the difference.
Yes. So when we moved from Iowa to New Jersey, we kept our cell phone numbers. And when we first got here, our kids' schools had blocked all calls from the Des Moines area code because so much spam comes from there. We weren't able to communicate with our kids' schools. I mean, we had to get to the bottom of that and clear that up. But it goes to show you, I think you're both right, that people are a deep cynicism about attempts to market and manipulate is a survival skill in this day and age. Like, you cannot navigate the modern world unless you have a kind of hard-boiled cynicism about people who are trying to offer you something. And so while my definition of evangelism isn't intended to be results-oriented, it is also the case that the only thing that's going to connect with people is authenticity. And so we have to help people speak authentically about what God is doing for them rather than train them to regurgitate a formula.
Do you think that has to happen in person? And here's sort of why I'm asking this question. So this whole journey that we're on sort of started with conversations that Thomas and I were having, and that Thomas was having with other clergy about, a post-Easter sort of, what we want to explore post-Easter. And I thought, well, let's explore the world on our doorstep and how we used to do evangelism by going door to door, the story of how Eastridge was built, and the church that I served in Michigan built much the same way. And what does mission mean now? So, it just used to look different. And I want to know practically what this looks like today. But as we're sharing and talking about this, I'm thinking, what about all of those posts on social media and on Facebook that are coming, like what is the line of when I take a picture, and we're super into Kate Bowler around here, as you well know, Matt. Well, it was our 20th reunion from seminary last year, and Kate Bowler was the speaker, and I got COVIDed out. So I didn't make it, but
fabulous.
Just tell me she was horrible. I didn't miss anything.
You missed it. Was very bad, and questionable personal hygiene. Just not. You ducked a bullet there, really.
The truth is, she's fabulous in pointing out that the life we portray on social media is not actually lived by anybody. So I know for a fact that I don't post a lot, but my husband Steve posts things, and we look like we're doing pretty awesome. But what nobody else sees is that when we all first got on this morning, I will speak only for myself and said, I feel like I live in depletion.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I'm always running behind, and like the days are dragging on, and there's a lot of mornings I share that the only reason I get out of bed is initially because I just am looking forward to a cup of coffee and some quiet, like those things are not the things that get shared on Facebook. So if we're presenting our faith in such a way that's like, look at how amazing my church is, what does that, is that no church is really like that, right? Like every church is having some of the same hiccups that we're having here, like running out of bulletins on a Sunday.
Right. Yes. I'm very guilty of the curated social media experience, like using Facebook and Instagram to present a vision of my life that is much, my children are always cute and always photogenic and always saying and doing adorable things, right?
They are.
And they're also not. And is this also something that people are becoming wise to or even cynical about, right? That's less clear to me. But I could imagine, you sort of asked at the beginning of that, does the connection for evangelism need to be face-to-face? As opposed, I think that you're a lot likelier to experience authenticity in the face-to-face. And social media can be a tool to get you to the face-to-face part. But if we want honesty and a sense of verisimilitude, you're going to get that in face-to-face encounter and not in pixels.
I want to ask forgiveness for my my reference to your most recent social media post where you actually did run out of bullets.
I like
and
running
I
out of bullets.
loved the way you
Better than-
reframed it. It's like when people say there's nowhere to park in the parking lot. I say, praise be to God, there's nowhere to park in our parking lot. Do you know how far I had to walk? I'm so glad you're here today. I'm so glad
problems to have.
you walked it. Like, it's such a great but there are and only social media is a great way to reframe some of that stuff and to share the story of what's happening. I just wanted to point out that there are, hiccups that we're all, there's no church right now that's, in my understanding of what's happening, no matter what you see on social media, there is no church right now that is just flat out killing it.
That's right.
Yeah. And yet that ideal of being polished or exceptionally good at what you're doing, that's a narrative that's deep in us, both individually and as churches. And it messes with that other part. I realize we are really actually mostly talking about church growth and not about evangelism, because that's where the conversation pulls us, because probably that's what rubs us, that connection is not working the way our forefathers, I say intentionally that way, started us off. And we participate in it as well as churches. That's what I'm trying to say. Is like when you said before that the cynicism that is necessary as a response. I remember like in March 2020, everyone said, hey, can you imagine Facebook and it's free and you can stream and have so many more people watching it. And we participate to online noise that then makes people having to filter out more. There's that is kind of frustrating, isn't it?
Does that require a way of thinking about church that, I agree, I guess because it's March, I'm thinking a lot about COVID and about that horrible pivot that we all had to make. But there was something a little giddy about those early days. For those of us, there were congregations who had been doing online worship for a long time. I wasn't serving one of them. And so to have to all of a sudden make this pivot to online video and like, oh, hey, look at all these likes, look at all these eyeballs. And there was something, it felt self-justifying because of the giddiness and the excitement. And
good word.
Having an opportunity now to take a step back and say, how do we make sure that that aspect of church life doesn't take over, but sort of is in its proper place? Because we are about authentic human connection. And my sense is that that's more likely to happen face-to-face than on online platforms and spaces.
I like that reframing to connection, and I can come back to that word over and over again, because my instant reaction was like, well, we want to make an impact, and you get those likes and the eyes, so you're doing something. that feedback loop there. But more than impact, it's really the connection, and that requires more eye level, and that is that's also much smaller. We're getting back, Melody, we're getting back to your friends 3 feet around us, in a way, right? And there are not that many people who fit in there, as we wish to, as influencers, right?
Yeah. Do you know about this, Mardis? You know about it because you were there for this sermon, and I'm spacing on his name because I have brain fog. It's we went to school with him. His name is Greg
Ellison.
Okay.
And he preached his sermon, and he was talking. Do you remember this? I was sitting next to you in the chapel, and I remember clearly it was like his senior. Remember at the end of seminary they did those like sermons every day, and like Jonathan Walton was one, and Greg Ellison was one, and it wasn't the regular chapel service. It was like highlighting. I think maybe Alex did one anyway. And Greg Ellison preached about what it was like to be at his grandmother's table eating her good food, and this conversation that he would have with her all the time about saying, how do you change the world? And, there's so many things happening. And she would say, like, it's about the 3 feet in front of you. Like, and did you know there's a song by Carrie Newcomer that like he's worked with Parker Palmer and all this, so we talk a lot about the 3 feet in front of us.
Okay. So that's interesting, because part of what was giddy about the pivot to online and COVID was every single church's reach became theoretically global, right? If I'm putting my worship on Facebook or some kind of live stream, then people from halfway around the world might find. And I think most churches, I'm sure Eastridge has this, have people who found the church from a distance and are participating in its online life despite living out of state or maybe out of country, or and we could so we're in Lent, and we just heard back in First Lent the story of the temptation of Jesus. The tempter comes in the wilderness and says, well, you can do this, you can do that. Your church could have global reach. You could be, and what a great distraction from the 3 feet in front of us, right? To go chasing after that, or to think that confers some kind of validation when it's what's right in front of me that is where God is most likely to be found, and where there is most likely good work for me to do.
So in all of this, the thing I keep thinking is, and I might lose my Presbyterian card and get kicked out.
Oh my goodness.
We won't know.
I wonder if at the core of evangelism, and what I really struggle with, is caring whether or not other people are Christian.
Ooh.
And the tone of evangelism to convert somebody, to bring them into a community that I find value while respecting who they are. And I haven't figured out if someone is connected spiritually, but not through what I know to be God in Jesus Christ, do I care? And I think that really, like, it's that idea. And, and Queen Elizabeth II just died. And we talked to, we can talk about the end of colonialism and the end of like trying to go out and make Christians of all nations. And so like, if I'm not out there saying, this is God, this is what I know to be God in Jesus Christ, and you should believe in this God too, because this God that I worship is not like the God you hear most often in the media about Christians. Like, that's just, I love, is it Diana Butler Bass and Tripp Fuller who have started talking about many Christianities. There's many, there's not just one Christian truth. There's many different ways that many of us are living this out. And there always has been. We just haven't always heard those stories.
So, but do we really, can I ask that? Do we really care if people are Christian?
Mm.
Did I just get kicked out?
Eh.
Maybe.
I mean, the instant reaction we need to say is reiterate what you just said, Matt, earlier, was the disconnection from evangelism from church growth. Yes. That is, we just need to say that again, and then that may be even your most faithful expression of your faith. That the other does not need to become you in your faith.
Yes. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but that is exact. First of all, I think that there's more grounding in the Reformed tradition for this perspective. I mean, even classically, than you can check me on this, but I think it's the Second Helvetic Confession that says, we know that God hath some friends outside the commonwealth of Israel. Like at its best, at its greatest integrity, the Reformed tradition understood very early on that God gets around, right? And that God relates and connects to people in ways that we don't necessarily see or understand. But then to Thomas's point, I think the way a lot of evangelism was classically understood was about a coping mechanism for dealing with difference. If I am nurtured in the church and brought up in the faith, and then at some point I discover that there are people who do not share my faith, my perspective, do not pray to my God, this is upsetting to me. This threatens my worldview. And one way I can cope with the anxiety is to try to go and make those people like my people. That will reduce the dissonance. And I think that colonialist mission project that got so big in sort of the late 19th, early 20th century, where we're going to spread Christianity and democracy and the American way of life so that those heathen are like us and we don't have to be disturbed by the fact that they're different anymore. So for me, that then comes back to Anna Carter Florence, that difference is sacred. Difference is a gift. And if someone is not like me, the appropriate response to that difference is not to try to absorb it, convert it, but rather to be curious about it, to approach with humility and listen for the places in which that different experience overlaps with my own. I can get very excited about that, but
I think this is really, I think this is spot on. And the anxiety of dealing with difference. I do want to add an anxiety, since I like to read Kierkegaard. Is the other anxiety I sense within myself, fellow church people, is that if we don't make other like me, if we don't learn to speak at our faith in a way that is kind of expansive, we disappear. Or our faith may evaporate, or our church community, and that's how it connects again with the church growth thing. Is like if we don't articulate our faith in these forms, what then is left of my faith? What's left in our faith communities? Yeah. Does that make sense?
I think it does to me. You're talking about kind of correct me if I'm wrong, the sense, if my church is growing, if we're bringing people in, we're making people more like us, there is validation in that. There's something I can look at and say, yes, we're on. It's kind of like McDonald's saying billions and billions served. It becomes a rationale for it. Doesn't matter that the hamburgers are garbage. If you've sold enough of them, it becomes its own rationale, its own justification. People like us, we must be okay. And if that's what we're talking about, the only basis for hope, the only basis for faith that I'm authorized to have is that God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. That's it. And so if I am putting my faith in, oh, my church is growing, oh, people are happy, oh, the budget's in the black, that is something, that's actually a pagan way of thinking about church. If we follow the one who raises the crucified, then it stands to reason that we will not always or even often have visible, tangible, material signs of victory and success. It's church under the sign of the cross.
Agreed. You're mute, Melody.
Muted. Sounds very Lutheran. Sounds like Luther there living in under the cross. But I think that I've really appreciated this discussion, and I don't know that I have any more answers about evangelism. But I think that as a pastor, what I really appreciate and that I would love to embrace is the important, and we've talked a lot about this, so this is not new since the pandemic. I think it is so important for us to be sharing our story of where we are finding God. And that's why in Mardis, this definition you gave us in the beginning, that God is doing for me. And I have to say that I am not always aware enough of my surroundings or aware enough of my own soul or aware enough of, my life to be able to identify that. And so it is so helpful to be able to share that story with others who can help point to what God is doing. And I'm going to credit the United Church of Christ and their wonderful ad campaign from 20 years ago, God is still speaking, which even after seminary, when we were first starting out in ministry, I didn't feel like that. I didn't feel like the church was attending to where God is still speaking. I think the anxiety that I see in me and in good, faithful people who are, participating in the life of churches everywhere is a fear that they're not going to know my favorite hymn. They're not going to know my favorite song. Will they understand how meaningful communion is when it's shared in this way that I find meaning in it? And I think sometimes that comes out in anxiety of like, well, that's not the way we do things. That's not the way, that's not the way things are done. And so we carry this anxiety of like, well, I have to make it this way that it used to be because nobody's going to know how important that was. And I think that one of the things that I would love for churches everywhere to embrace is that if people tell their story, then that has more hope for the future that to be carried on than institutionalizing and saying, this is the way we do things. We have to do things this way. We have to sing this hymn. Like, nobody's going to forget the words to Amazing Grace. Nobody's going to forget the words to How Great Thou Art. But they're not going to necessarily have a personal connection with them unless you share it. I mean, I remember clearly one of my professors from college, Jerry Sitzer, and he has this, this story of like he lost his wife, his daughter, and his mother or mother-in-law in a tragic car accident. And one of his other children was injured, and he was teaching at Whitworth, now university. And I remember being in class with him and him saying, "Be thou my vision," is what we sang at my wedding, at all of our children's baptisms, and at their funerals. And then we sang it together, and he cried. And we cried. And every time we sing Be Thou My Vision, to this day, I think of how important that hymn was to his life of faith,
Right.
Or I remember him saying, "Of the Father's love begotten," and us singing it together and talking about the history of that hymn and how it was handed on, and it's a Gregorian chant and all the like. So when I sing it, I'm carrying in me his story because he shared his personal connection. So I wonder if evangelism is really just saying, do you know, this is my connection. This is how God is working whenever I sing this hymn, or whenever I read this Bible verse, or when I do the right thing. That's a really hard thing, but I did the right thing because I remember when someone did the right thing for me. I remember when someone sat by me after my spouse died. I remember when someone sat with me when my child was sick. I remember when someone brought me food because I was having surgeries. I remember all of these things, and that's how God is still working in my life. And then sharing that,
Yes.
but not in a way that is, and you have to come to my church, or you might be, I might not see you again. Like, that's not evangelism. That's not evangelism.
To share it in a way that you're not attached to it. I think that's the trick, that this is deeply meaningful for me, and I honor you by sharing it, and you honor me by receiving it, but I don't require that it be binding for you, or that you, therefore we have to sing "Be Thou My Vision." That's the middle hymn every Sunday forever, right? And that balance, it's such a terrible cliche, but it makes a lot of sense that I'm finally in Presbyterian circles, because the work of Karl Barth has been so important to me. There's a guy named Gary Dorian who is absolutely not a scholar of Karl Barth. He is a scholar of the liberal theological tradition in the United States. But he wrote a book on Barth that has the best title. It's called, I think it's called Theology Without Weapons, or it's something without weapons. But the idea that part of Barth's project was saying that the truth does not need to be defended or imposed or coerced. It requires no help from the forces of violence, be they literal or rhetorical. It can stand on its own. So truth in that sense is deeply vulnerable. The truth that we share about what God is doing for us does not go out into the world with any guarantee of being heard or received or meeting with success. It just goes and is entirely entrusted to God. The other thing, Mel, that you got me thinking that my definition would benefit from underlining a little more is how important God's people are. I really can't share what God is doing for me. I can't see it entirely by myself. I need the rest of the community to help me to see it. They need me to see it in them. And when we name what we see in one another, that's part of how we're building up the body and being church together, to carry other people's stories the way that you have with your professor. I think that's the way it's supposed to work.
You are so Presbyterian.
Guilty.
Which I love. I want to give a few minutes. This has been as fabulous. I've just been in a good mood since I walked into my office this morning in anticipation of this fabulous discussion, and it's been as interesting for me as and wonderful for me as I anticipated. And so I'm just thankful for both of you. But I want to make sure that we have time for any last comments or any final words of wisdom.
Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Yeah.
Let it be. Amen. I do want to.
I just want to underline that the without weapons. I think that is, and that comes back to my initial knee-jerk reaction to evangelism, because I think
Sure.
evangelism has been with weapons, not
Yes.
a lot in history with weapons, with physical weapons, but often also the subtle ones. And that's so good. That's great. And isn't that awesome that a liberal theologian would write a book on Bart, and here together is the great synthesis, which both would hate, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to thank you, Mardis, and I want to go back and say that I don't know of any church that's killing it, but I do see a lot of good things about things you're doing in the great state of Pennsylvania, and I always love to hear you preach, and you can be found on Facebook every Sunday. And so I will not hold it against anyone if they decide to check you out on a Sunday morning from afar or during the week. I've really appreciated your friendship over the years. And same for you, Thomas. 10 years. So Mardis, I've known you for 25 years.
25. Yeah, fall of 99.
And Thomas and I have been working together now for 10 years. So half of my career, I have worked with Thomas Dummermuth, and it's just a privilege to call you both friends. So
thank you. Really great meeting you.
Yep. Yeah. Good to finally connect. This was great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I think that's it.
Like,
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Oh,
it really was
you.
as good as I thought it would be.
The
so
only thing
interesting.
that will make this better would be actually around the table.
Oh, I know, right? Well, you're gonna grow this thing and get a budget for like bringing people out and being in person, right? I mean, that's just a matter of time.
Yeah, there's that very ambivalent growth impetus again. Yeah, that's
it's really our attempt at asynchronous church, but in all so Vince, who used to be here every Sunday and doing our online worship stream, has expressed more of an interest in sort of perfecting our podcast. And so he wants us to do more of them. So we may come back just for interesting conversations, because you're always a great conversation partner. And I've told Thomas this before, but seriously, I would not have graduated from seminary without relying on Mardis's smartness.
And I wouldn't have wanted to go there if you hadn't been there. So, yeah, that worked out.
There you go.
It was great. Tell MB and the kids hello.
Well,
and I didn't see her play. She was in a play. She was in a Purim.
There was no live stream, no internet, nothing. But it was a Purim play that was a mashup of the story of Esther and the Broadway musical Wicked. And it was really, she was the only goy in the cast. The rabbi had sent out, like, we're having open auditions. Anybody should come. I sent it to her. She went, and she ended up being the only non-Jewish person who was cast. And it was a lot of fun. And she got to sing and act, and just, she needs that outlet and hasn't had it, so.
She is rockin' awesome and can sing and act and do all of that.
Wicked and Esther?
Wicked and Esther, yeah. So they
and your daughter had
reworked some. Well, I think what would be controversial is that it envisioned Haman and Mordecai as being more like frenemies, and created a scene at the end of the show so that they could sing "Changed for Good," where Mordecai goes to Haman in his cell, like right before he's going to hang, and they the hug, kiss, and make up. I mean, it was sort of weird, but they had fun.
So that really blows my mind even more. I thought maybe Vashti rehabilitated.
Yeah, no, right. You would think that, but
yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I wish it had been streamed or something.
I heard a lot of church folk were saying the same thing. It was actually at the same time as my church's youth group. So, oh well. But,
well, you both are the best. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And
thank you.
Yes, we'll talk soon.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sunrise Road podcast. Our podcast is hosted by me, Thomas Dummermuth.
And me, Melody Jones Poynton. And it is edited by Vince Rule.
The Sunrise Road podcast is a ministry of East Ridge Presbyterian Church. please like and subscribe, and